In our last explainer, we audited the machinery of institutions. We saw how complex bureaucracies accumulate a quiet, unseen coherence debt long before they visibly fracture. But, machinery requires an operating environment, and for a free society, that environment is democracy. When we apply a structural lens to this, we're forced to look past the personalities and the daily headlines, and instead examine the foundational architecture. We have to look at the routing of information. We're almost always taught to measure the health of a democracy by the sheer loudness of its disagreements. It's incredibly common to assume that polarization and fierce political battles are the primary vectors of systemic failure. But from an engineering standpoint, this is a massive analytical error. Conflict isn't the enemy of the system. In fact, a democracy does not fail when people argue.
It fails when argument completely loses its root back to reality. The true pathology of a collapsing system isn't that its citizens have conflicting priorities. No, the system collapses only when those disagreements can no longer process data, correct errors, and update our collective understanding of the world.
Section 1. The Democratic Coordination Field.
Okay, let's dive into this. A free society is supposed to contain tension. It's explicitly designed to house competing interests and conflicting interpretations of risk. If we frame this purely as structural engineering, a democracy is a highly advanced, decentralized coordination field. It allows massive populations to process all that conflicting real-world data, negotiate the internal stresses, and constantly rewrite the rules. Basically, argument is the raw material this entire machine runs on.
Moving on to Section 2, the feedback loop.
Let's see how this builds. The life of any functional society absolutely relies on this specific sequence. A public signal is generated. Institutions respond. A policy action is taken, which yields a real-world result, leading to public accountability, and finally, a necessary correction. When this loop works, a healthy democracy runs its relaxation curves perfectly. It acts as a masterful debt-clearing mechanism where conflict literally drives necessary adaptation.
But what happens at the exact moment of failure? Well, when institutions respond too slowly to visible stress, that continuous loop is severed. The same arguments repeat, the same failures recur, and distrust just deepens. The buildings might look secure, and the voting rituals continue, but the structure can't translate conflict into correction anymore. It just generates endless heat with zero structural repair.
Which brings us to Section 3, narrative fragmentation.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast between what citizens experience on the surface and the underlying systemic pathology that's actually destroying the network. Citizens experience media overload, but the system experiences an information routing failure. Citizens see performative conflict, theatrical battles designed just to capture attention, while the system suffers a devastating loss of authentic feedback. It's this catastrophic context drift that begins to tear the whole operating environment apart.
And the consequence of this fragmentation is profound. Different sections of the population begin to route their understanding of the world through entirely different facts, different fears, and different logic gates. They use totally different definitions of what even counts as evidence. The population doesn't merely disagree on how to solve a problem. They no longer agree on what the problem actually is. Common ground just completely vanishes.
Section 4. Trust as infrastructure. We really need to stop viewing trust as just a moral virtue and start seeing it for what it actually is, a physical mechanism. When trust is healthy, bad news travels efficiently. Errors are admitted. Citizens can disagree without hostility. But when trust erodes, everyday democratic coordination becomes prohibitively expensive. You've probably felt this yourself. Every basic claim requires defense. Every expert is suspect. Every single fact becomes a tribal object, and every necessary compromise is perceived as a complete betrayal. So, the crucial point is this. Trust is simply the low-friction infrastructure required to coordinate. It's the bridge that allows a society to function without having to verify every single fact from absolute zero every single morning. Without that medium, the shared map simply cannot be updated.
Section 5, coherence debt.
For our analysis, coherence debt is the ultimate metric for understanding why institutions quietly hollow out. It's the structural vulnerability that forms when a system encounters stress but fails to recover from it. Because the coordination costs are too high and the institutions are too slow, the state begins to export its operational costs into the future. It's literally borrowing stability from tomorrow just to maintain a superficial, brittle peace today.
You can feel the cascading systemic drag when this debt piles up. Decisions are consistently delayed. Clear warnings become highly politicized. Underlying problems are just rebranded instead of actually being solved. Responsibilities continuously blur across bureaucracies, and institutions react far too slowly to the reality on the ground. A fragile democracy simply postpones the arguments it desperately needs to resolve.
Let's look at the big picture in Section 6, the resilience metric.
And this brilliantly illustrates that we are not tracking some unique ideological crisis here. We're tracking a fundamental, scale-free recovery failure. The physics of failure are identical across complex networks. Think about it. Physical roads crack when their materials can't absorb disturbance. Energy grids fail when synchronization loses coherence. AI systems drift when they can't recover the thread, and democracies fracture when their information layers can no longer maintain a shared map of the world.
Which tells us exactly what resilience actually looks like. A resilient democracy isn't one where everyone magically agrees. That wouldn't be freedom. And it's not one where conflict disappears. That wouldn't be reality. Resilience is the ability of citizens to share enough basic reality to repair what is breaking. It's keeping disagreement firmly connected to real-world correction. When a population can no longer agree on where the cracks are, repair becomes literally impossible. Not because people are arguing, but because argument has lost its route back to reality. Truth has nowhere stable to land. Which leaves us to consider one stark, undeniable structural question. Can a democracy survive if its people no longer share enough reality to repair it?